Guess what? I just booked us on Royal Caribbean Ovation of the Seas, sailing this October.
No way! That's the one that goes to Penang, Phuket and Bali, right?
Yep, one trip, multiple places, no unpacking, no hassle.
Wow! And did I hear something about a giveaway?
Yes, just book before 1st October and stand a chance to win a brand new BYD Sea Lion 7. TNC supply.
Luxury at sea and on land? Let's go!
Call 31572943 or hit royalcaribbean.sg to book now.
You're listening to a CNA podcast.
I'm Arnold Gay. In this episode of CNA Correspondent, it's all about the dust settling on U.S. tariffs. I speak to Toni Waterman in Washington, D.C.
All about leverage. It's really part of his DNA. And he seems to realize that many countries will just accept this as the new normal and something that they're willing to deal with if that means they can retain access to the U.S. market.
And Leong Kit here in Southeast Asia.
Back in the financial crisis or during COVID, there's a range where certain countries have it better and some not so. This time round, the tariffs hit everyone.
And later, she's not a correspondent, but Deborah Elms is a trade expert, and she will tell you what you need to know.
I do think that Asia on the whole is better set up for these kinds of pivots than a lot of other regions, not the least of which is because this region has invested for decades, actually, in closer integration, in building out potential alternative platforms.
First, the leader who put the words trade and tariffs into the headlines daily.
We have made a few deals today that are excellent deals for the country. You know, we're taking in literally trillions of dollars for the country. This is making our country very rich and respected again.
Toni, Kit, good to have you both on the show today. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's talk through what it means for the world and particularly for Asia. Toni, I imagine jubilation and vindication at the White House. So what did Trump and his trade warriors see about tariffs that many economists and analysts simply failed to see?
Well, I think what economists failed to see, because there really was no large-scale precedent for it, is the mass capitulation by countries around the world to Trump's tariff demands. The last time the U.S. tried to do something like this was in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley Act, which imposed tariffs on tens of thousands of goods coming into the United States. And it was a complete disaster. And it actually worsened the Great Depression in the U.S., mainly because other countries retaliated. They implemented tariffs on American goods. That has not happened this time around. In fact, the only country that has retaliated is China. The rest have either begrudgingly accepted these tariff rates or are feverishly trying to negotiate the lower rate. I think Trump, though, not only recognizes, but is not afraid to exploit the leverage America, as the world's largest economy, has. You know, his book, The Art of the Deal, is all about leverage. It's really part of his DNA. And he seems to realize that many countries will just accept this as the new normal and something that they're willing to deal with if that means they can retain access to the U.S. market.
Kit. So how much of that is true? Because initially there was some effort by ASEAN in particular to try and band together, increase intra-block trade. But in the end, is it really you just can't quit America?
Well, I would say you can't, because the world is so intertwined and decoupling is going to be very counterproductive. It's like two families who are married to each other. You know, you've got a happy marriage and suddenly you've got problems. Separating and divorcing is going to be very complicated. And if you look at US and ASEAN's relationship, it's so interconnected in terms of security, in terms of the political interests and the economic sphere. And look, US is ASEAN's second largest trading partner after China. And ASEAN is, for Washington, fourth largest trading partner. Also, for ASEAN, US is the largest source of foreign direct investment. So for ASEAN, it's like a case of, look, let's not have this bitter divorce. Let's see how we can work things out to sustain this relationship rather than going for a divorce.
Toni, there is a but. I'm not sure how big this but is at this time, because we've seen the inflation numbers, we've seen the jobs numbers. So I'm curious, what are business leaders and Americans saying right now? I mean, we had the Sunday talk shows. What's the chatter in particular to what Jameson Greer has said about tariffs, that they are not going to be changed? They're more or less set.
I think a lot of business leaders, nobody's terribly happy about these tariffs, even those manufacturers that are making their product in the United States, because they know how expensive it can be just to manufacture and kind of get all these products out to the American public. But the president seems to have waned in his willingness to negotiate as this deadline draws closer, this new deadline, which is coming up on Thursday. And certainly there was a number of White House officials that were making the rounds on Sunday morning TV, trying to set the tone for these final days, because as Jameson Greer put it, his phone is going to be blowing up now that the deadline is getting really close. But he said on CBS's Face the Nation that the tariff rates are pretty much set and that he does not expect the rates to be negotiated lower in the coming days. We also heard from the director of the White House National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett. He had a slightly more nuanced view, saying on NBC's Meet the Press that he expects talks to continue with countries who have not yet reached a deal with the U.S. It's always kind of hard to tell with Donald Trump if he actually means what he is saying or whether this is all part of some negotiating ploy. So we could perhaps see a couple of more deals squeaked out in the coming days. But according to the administration, this is kind of it. This is where the tariffs are going to be staying.
Waikit, broadly speaking, how's ASEAN doing? They've had like 3 days or so to digest their individual tariff rates. Have they come to terms with this new trading environment yet?
I think right from the very start, ASEAN has already expected the worst. And the thing is, ASEAN had decided to not retaliate. It chose to negotiate. But the thing is, the negotiations are taking place not as a bloc. So it's not as if ASEAN can band together and then discuss this with Washington. The negotiations for these trade tariffs to go down are all on a bilateral basis. What ASEAN can do at most as a bloc is to come up with a unified position, express statements, express concerns, which they did. While I was in KL during the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, they did come together to collectively say, look, trade tariffs are not productive. But that's the extent as ASEAN as a bloc can do. Many governments in Southeast Asia would stress that trade is a key strategy for them. And now that trade is seemingly weaponized, it's going to be a lot more difficult for these governments to use trade as a strategy.
And have they told you whether or not they intend to pick up the phone and try and get in touch with Greer or whoever it might be? They have 3 days. There was a lot of talk that they would, try and lower rates. The Philippines, a good example of a country that's trying to do that. Or is it, do you think it's going to be more sectoral relief that they'll be looking at now?
I think in general, it's safe to say that all countries will want to continuously see how they can, come up with a better deal. But the problem is trade deal takes years to negotiate. I mean, there are complex details. It involves not just one, two, but multiple agencies and from both sides at that. I think for now, countries like Malaysia, they say, well, generally they're quite happy with the 19% tariffs, but we also know that industries such as your semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, right now they face 0% tariff. It's under review. So I'm quite certain that Malaysia is prepared to negotiate further when that review comes. In Singapore, for instance, we have our task force man. He's our Deputy Prime Minister, Gan Kim Yong. Mm-hmm. He's given this moniker because he heads so many task forces in Singapore. And one of it is to negotiate as well as to weather the storm that the tariffs would have on Singapore. So on the Singapore front, the government has set aside funds to help businesses adapt as well as to face the impact from tariffs. Myanmar, which I cover, Army General Min Aung Hlaing has reached out to US President Donald Trump, saying that he is ready to send high-level delegation for negotiations. Now, that did not happen. The tariff for Myanmar remains at about 40%. And I'm just interested to see whether or not Mr. Trump will use this trade tariff as a trump card, the way he had used it for the Thailand-Cambodia border dispute, to see whether he will use this to move the needle on Myanmar, getting Myanmar to say, look, you resolve your issues, and then we'll see whether we can discuss trade tariffs.
Whatever the final tariff rate is for ASEAN, even if it's the 10% starting point, going to as high as 40%, plus that transshipment levy as well, which ASEAN countries are going to be hit hardest? I mean, are we looking at job losses potentially, Waikit?
Well, I think that may be inevitable. I mean, the fact is, ASEAN is facing its most serious crisis as a bloc. I was just speaking with an expert who had said, look, now is the time for ASEAN to act strongly because never before has all 10 ASEAN countries faced such serious implications. Back in the financial crisis or during COVID, there's a range where certain countries have it better and some not so. This time round, the tariffs hit everyone. Yes, there's a range between 10 and 40%, but the fact is, it affects all these countries because supply chains will be disrupted. High tariffs will make it more expensive for goods to go from point A to point B. So companies may think about, maybe we should relocate, maybe we should close down, and smaller businesses don't have that kind of capacity to withstand this storm. So job losses at the end of the day may be unavoidable. That said, the bloc as a whole is trying to take effort to minimize this impact. So we've been hearing many of these ministers talking about deepening their economic integration. What this means really is if within ASEAN there are tariffs that they face with each other, they take that away. So that's one. They're also trying to diversify and look at working with more partners instead of just putting all your eggs in one basket. And also, recently at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who is the ASEAN chair, had urged the bloc's foreign and economic ministers to work more closely together at the bloc level to see how they can react to all these tariff implications. Now, at the same time, it's quite certain that countries will continue to want to maintain as low a tariff as possible, or at least be on the same level playing field as others in the region.
Arnold, just if I can jump in on what Kit said just there. I mean, I think that what's interesting is, he was just talking about, this is an opportunity for ASEAN to band together against these tariffs. And I myself have been wondering for the last couple of months, how is it that the rest of the world is not banding together against the United States? You have one superpower kind of unilaterally imposing and forcing these tariffs on, 200 nations. Certainly, if 200 nations came together and, fought back against these tariffs, there might be something different happening in Washington. I mean, that's maybe a question for Dr. Elms, but it's something to really think about.
It is indeed. You know what? Dr. Elms has just logged on, and I will be asking her that exactly. Toni and Waikit, thank you very much for joining us on the first part of the CNA Correspondent podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Let's say hello now to Deborah Elms, who isn't a CNA correspondent, but a trade expert at the Heinrich Foundation. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I want to start by asking you what's happened. It's taking shape. We can clearly see that. Let's call it phase one of a process which some, including the European Commission president, calling it a rebalancing of global trade. So what exactly does that mean? And what would you count as the biggest change that we are going to have to deal with this side of the world in particular?
Well, let me start with what I think is an analogy that makes it easier to understand. So imagine that we've been flying on an airplane with at least two or more engines that have been working fine. And for the last however long, decades really, the plane has been up in the air. And one of the most important engines on that plane has been the United States economy. It has been powering the flight for a very long time. Donald Trump has decided to either shut the engine off or at least have the engine fire intermittently. And the net result of that is that the rest of the plane has to decide how they're going to manage this. Now, clearly, the plane doesn't crash immediately if the engine stops, but the plane can no longer fly as it used to. At the very least, it has to land sooner. You have to think harder about, how are you using the gasoline reserves on the plane? How are you loaded? We're at that point where the shutoff valve has been hit on the U.S. engine. And we now have to figure out, what does that mean for the rest of us? How far can the plane go? What does it mean? Can you continue to operate with the United States? Are you going to pivot away from the U.S. market? And so you can imagine, using my airplane analogy, like why this seems like such a shock, because for decades, we haven't had to think about whether or not the U.S. airplane engine has been working. It's just, of course, it's been working. And it's only now that we have to think about what happens if it isn't working or isn't working as it used to.
So here's what puzzles me, and this was a question raised by our correspondents Toni and Waikit earlier as well. if the US accounts for 15%, probably a little bit less of total trade, and the rest of the world accounts for the rest of it, which presumably means the other engine. Why, didn't the rest of the world do something about it?
Well, this is a great question. I think there's a variety of reasons. So one is that you haven't had to think about it, right? So you have built up decades of integration, supply chains, diplomatic relations, et cetera, assuming that the U.S. engine would continue to fly. So you didn't really think about alternatives. Then once you suddenly flip the switch to turn that engine off, nobody's quite prepared for, well, what does that look like? And there's been a lot of confusion over the last 6 months. Well, is the engine permanently off? Is this a temporary, you flip the switch on and off? Is it going to fire at all? Like, we just don't know what the status is going to be. So part of the challenge has been, this is a completely unprecedented situation. Second, it's uncertain how long it will last and how deep the problems will be. Mm-hmm. And then the third major challenge for everybody else is a coordination problem. So you're in a situation where collectively, most would be better off if they cooperated together. So if you had some kind of coalition against Donald Trump, I think that you can imagine that would turn out better. It's harder to bully large groups of countries, for example. Mm-hmm. However, in a situation where the benefits are sharp and immediate and the consequences equally sharp and immediate, what happens with a coalition is it disintegrates very quickly. And everyone defects and does what they need to do for their domestic purposes. And so the early efforts to try to be coordinated quickly stopped. Now, that doesn't mean it stopped forever. And I actually think as we move into whatever we're moving into, phase 2 or 3 of this whole new world, there will be more coalition building, both by governments, and there will also be more coordination, I suspect, among companies to try to figure out how are we collectively across, especially our business units, supply chain, et cetera, how are we going to manage?
Okay, I hear you. So prevent immediate pain, each person, each man for himself first. But I'm wondering on that point about the great unknown. So how do Asia's businesses and CEOs assess, how they will move forward? I mean, the basis for the trading system as we knew it was premised on who builds things cheaper, who builds things better, comparative advantage, something I learned in school. So what do they have to do now in terms of making decisions about where they should make something, who they should hire, and who they should sell it to?
I do think that Asia on the whole is better set up for these kinds of pivots than a lot of other regions, not the least of which is because this region has invested for decades, actually, in closer integration, in building out potential alternative platforms, in thinking about new ways to provide better certainty for businesses, which is what is in such short supply at the moment. And I think that's going to stand Asia well. So how do you manage this as a company? I think, first of all, point one, how exposed are we to the U.S. market? And one of the things that we're learning is that often your exposure is not obvious to some of the companies, right? So they think, I sell, screws and fasteners, right? I don't think of myself as being part of a supply chain, and I don't think of myself as being particularly reliant on the U.S. market because I sell to, let's say, China or Taiwan or Korea or something, right? However, those parts end up in something that ends up in the United States. And so you are actually exposed to the United States, even if it's not obvious to you as a company. Point two, how valuable is that market to us? Because in some cases you say, well, if I sell screws and fasteners, I can sell those globally and maybe there's no consequence to that. If you sell bicycles, for example, maybe that the U.S. market actually is an important market for you because American consumers buy different kinds of bicycles than anyone else. And so you have to think hard about where else would we go with our bicycles? So how exposed, how reliant, and then what are the alternatives? And how quickly can I get those alternatives up and running? In some cases, thinking especially, well, what happens if this policy shifts? What happens if the United States changes its mind in, 4, 6, 10 years or doesn't? Okay. Then what do I do? And so I think one of the challenges for companies, of course, is that the uncertainty is extremely high and the risk is very high. Uh-huh. And trying to make decisions then is difficult. The instinct is to make no decisions at all. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we've been for 6 months. But now companies are increasingly realizing that actually this is going to continue for a while. We actually have to decide what to do and then do something. We can't just be in this period of sort of stasis forever.
And do you expect job losses as this whole process of adjustment takes place?
I think it's possible because you can't control how your final market's going to respond. You can't control what Donald Trump is up to. But I think for a lot of companies, they would say what we can control is our own internal costs. And so shedding staff, I think, is likely. It's going to be difficult to tease out the numbers, though, because it takes place at a time when we have other job challenges like AI that's resulting in shedding of employees. Also, we've got a lot of firms that hired for COVID and for what they thought was a sort of post-COVID world that are now realizing that that's not what they're in, and they're having to adjust their workforces. So I do think we're going to have job changes. Does it mean only loss? It's a little early to say, but I have to say I'm not optimistic in the short run because when you have this level of change and adjustment, it's hard to imagine that you're going to have this sort of bright future right around the corner for most firms doing most kinds of production.
To your point about all these changes to the global supply chain and how it may affect jobs, economies, and prices, if you'll bear with me and help me dumb this down even further about the impact on prices in particular. I mean, it's easy to understand when someone says if you impose a tariff on a product going into the US, prices will go up. But the question we often get and hasn't been answered to my satisfaction is, why should I here in Singapore, for example, be paying higher prices, for an iPhone, which is maybe made in India or China, and we don't have any tariffs on these products coming in? How does that happen?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that it will happen. And there is the potential for products that are being pivoted out of the US to end up in other markets and end up being cheaper. So my personal wish is that coffee beans, which are very expensive and being shipped to the United States, now subject to very high tariffs on most coffee producing countries, as high as 50% on Brazil and 20% on Vietnam. My hope is that those coffee growers look at Singapore and say, hey, here's a market, let's sell coffee beans more cheaply. They might do that. But I think one of the challenges is that at a time of disruption and when the US engine is shutting off, you're just going to have less demand. You're certainly going to have less demand for a lot of firms. And at a time of less demand, it's hard to imagine cutting prices in a period of less demand. The instinct, I suspect, will be to raise prices where you can.
Right.
And that's how you end up with this inflationary shock that's going to spread to other locations. So even places that think they're not exposed because they're not in the US, they're not dealing with the US, are likely to be hit by this particular challenge.
This whole issue of the weaponization of trade as well has cropped up. I mean, we hear about those plans against India and Brazil by President Trump. It's not new. I know it's not new because China's been doing it for a long time, but I'm wondering, is it clear how the weaponization of trade by the two biggest superpowers might change strategic economic alliances and lead to security dilemmas, which is a new dimension of problems as well?
Well, if you're going to shake up the system, then I think it's only natural that the system gets shaken up, not just in economics. You can't sort of wall that off and go, that's just purely who buys, coffee beans from location A. It's actually going to have political and security consequences. And so one of the things that I am wondering, and I don't have an answer for this, so this is just a question that I also don't know the answer to. In this negotiations that we've been having recently with the United States on what is the individual tariff numbers for each individual country, some have said, but we're very reliant on the U.S. security guarantee, and therefore we will have to accept a sort of higher tariff, et cetera. And again, this is not my area. I don't do security. But if I were a security expert, I would say, well, what gives you confidence that the United States continues to have the same views on your security guarantee? If you can completely change your views on the economic importance of partners, and you've now punished U.S. trade partners, historic trade partners, much more than historic trade adversaries. So the Canadians are in the front of being hit, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, et cetera. Like if you're hitting your friends hard in economics, what makes you think that only stays in economics and it doesn't somehow dilute your security preferences and your security guarantees? This is not my area, but I do think it's at least an open question whether or not the United States will continue to uphold its security commitments in the same way that it did, or whether those are also pivoting.
And how do you see this whole thing with China playing out? I mean, many are saying it's the big prize for Trump. That's his focus now, that he's sort of like sorted out some of these earlier trade deals. Do you think Beijing is going to be, willing to grant concessions to a clearly emboldened U.S. leader? Or will Xi Jinping look around and feel emboldened himself and force concessions from Donald Trump?
I will take a slightly contrary view on this one. I don't see evidence that Donald Trump, this time in office, is as concerned about China as he was the first time. I think for him, job done. I have now pivoted the U.S. They see the Chinese as not a friend, as more of an adversary, but one that has been relatively well contained. Therefore, I, Donald Trump, will worry less about China, actually, and more about the rest of the world. I don't want to fight China and everybody else at once. So therefore, we will continue in a sort of, Cold War, frozen relationship, perhaps, with China for a while I take on everybody else. Now, how long that lasts, does that last the rest of his term in office, is a little unclear. But at the moment, I don't expect him to pivot from trade war with everybody to escalation again of trade war with China. Of course, this is a huge gamble, right? Because everyone who is, part of the global economy cares about which way this U.S.-China relationship goes.
Fascinating stuff, Deborah. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to this special edition of the CNA Correspondent podcast. As always, you can catch reports from all our correspondents on CNA's YouTube channel and CNA.Asia. And please note, the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. The team behind this week's episode is Saye Win, Clara Ong, Tiffany Ang, Junaini Johari, Peining Ho, Nat Vario, and Craig Dale. I'm Arnold Gay. See you next time.
Guess what? I just booked us on Royal Caribbean Ovation of the Seas, sailing this October.
No way! That's the one that goes to Penang, Phuket, and Bali, right?
Yep, one trip, multiple places, no unpacking, no hassle.
Wow! And did I hear something about a giveaway?
Yes, just book before 1st October and stand a chance to win a brand new BYD Sea Lion 7. TNC Supply.
Luxury at sea and on land? Let's go!
Call 3157-2943 or hit royalcaribbean.sg to book now.